Hey there, I'm Harold Mitchell, 78 years old, and I've been farming this land for 57 years, ever since my daddy passed it down to me when I was barely 21. You know, there's something about working the same soil for over half a century that makes you understand things most folks never will, like how the earth speaks to you through the changing seasons, how every fence post has a story, and how sometimes the people you love most can become strangers right before your eyes. If you think old farmers are easy targets, smash that like button because you're about to learn otherwise, and let me tell you, what happened on my farm last week will change everything you thought you knew about family loyalty and the price of greed. You see, my daughter-in-law Sarah thought she had it all figured out when she convinced my son Tommy that this old man was too senile to manage 400 acres of prime Iowa farmland anymore. But what Sarah didn't know was that beneath these weathered hands and behind these tired eyes lived a man who'd survived 3 droughts, 2 tornadoes, and 1 divorce. And I wasn't about to let some city girl who married my boy for his inheritance potential take away everything 4 generations of Mitchells had built. Stick around, because this story will blow your mind, and you'll understand why sometimes the best revenge is served not cold, but with the patience of a farmer waiting for the perfect harvest. The Mitchell farm sits about 20 miles outside of Cedar Rapids, stretching across rolling hills that turn golden with corn in summer and white with snow in winter. A patchwork quilt of fields that my great-grandfather first plowed with horses back in 1892. Every morning for the past 57 years, I've woken up at 4:30 without an alarm clock, made myself a pot of black coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and walked out onto my front porch to watch the sun paint the sky pink and orange over fields that know my footsteps better than any church floor ever could. The main house, built by my grandfather in 1923, stands proud despite its age, white clapboard siding that I repaint every 3 years, green shutters that my late wife Margaret picked out in 1972, and a wraparound porch where 5 generations of Mitchells have sat in rocking chairs, watching storms roll in and seasons change. My son, Tommy, was born in the downstairs bedroom on a snowy February morning 45 years ago, back when we still had the old wood stove heating the place and Doc Henderson made house calls. I taught that boy everything I knew about farming, from reading the weather and cloud formations to knowing when a cow's about to calve just by the way she holds her tail, from fixing a John Deere engine with nothing but determination and WD-40 to understanding that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. Tommy was a good boy, helped with chores without being asked, could drive a tractor by age 10, and understood that farming wasn't just a job, but a way of life that connected us to something bigger than ourselves. But then, Tommy went off to Iowa State for agricultural science, which I supported because education never hurt nobody. And that's where he met Sarah, a business major from Chicago who looked at our farm the way a developer looks at an empty lot, seeing dollar signs where I saw heritage. Sarah was pretty enough, I'll give her that, with her salon blonde hair and those calculating green eyes that never quite warmed up even when she smiled, and she had a way of making Tommy feel like he was destined for bigger things than just being a farmer's son. They got married right after graduation in a fancy ceremony that cost more than I made in a good year, and Sarah insisted they needed to live in Des Moines where the opportunities were, visiting the farm only on holidays and special occasions, each visit shorter than the last. At first, Sarah played the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law pretty well, complimenting my late wife's cooking, asking about the history of various farm implements rusting in the barn, even pretending to be interested when I'd tell stories about the Great Flood of '93 or the year we had to sell half the herd to make ends meet. But after Margaret passed from cancer 8 years ago, Sarah's mask started slipping, especially when she'd catch Tommy looking at the farm with the kind of longing that comes from bones that know where they belong. She'd make little comments about how much work the place was for one old man, how the equipment was outdated, how the methods were old-fashioned, always with that concerned expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. The thing about farming is that it teaches you patience and observation, skills that serve you well when you're trying to understand people's true intentions. And I noticed how Sarah's eyes would linger on the deed to the farm hanging in my office, how she'd ask seemingly innocent questions about property values and development potential, how she'd steer conversations toward my health and whether I'd thought about retirement communities. Tommy, bless his heart, seemed oblivious to his wife's growing obsession with the farm's value. Too caught up in his job at some agricultural consulting firm to notice how his wife was circling like a vulture, waiting for the old farmer to drop. My daily routine hadn't changed much over the years, even after Margaret's passing. Wake before dawn, coffee and toast with homemade strawberry jam from berries grown in Margaret's garden that I still tended. Then out to check on the animals. Though I'd downsized from the full dairy operation to just a couple dozen head of cattle, some chickens for eggs, and 2 horses that were probably older than they should be for working animals but had earned their retirement. The corn and soybean rotation continued like clockwork, though I'd started renting out some of the further fields to the Jacobson boys next door, good kids who respected the land and always paid their rent on time. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything started to unravel, one of those perfect autumn days when the air is crisp, but the sun still has warmth, and the leaves are just starting to turn gold and red along the creek that cuts through the south pasture. I was out fixing a section of fence that the neighbor's bull had taken a disliking to when I saw Tommy's silver SUV kicking up dust on the long gravel drive. Unusual for a weekday when he should have been at work. As the vehicle got closer, I could see Sarah in the passenger seat, her face set in that determined expression that reminded me of a banker about to foreclose. They pulled up to the house, and I walked over, wiping my hands on my work pants, noticing how Tommy couldn't quite meet my eyes and how Sarah was carrying a leather folder that looked official and expensive. We sat on the porch, me in my grandfather's rocking chair that creaked with every movement. Them on the swing that Margaret and I used to sit on during summer evenings, watching fireflies dance over the fields. Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries, launching into a prepared speech about how concerned they were about my living alone, how the farm was too much for one person, how there were wonderful assisted living facilities that would be perfect for someone my age. Tommy sat there like a puppet with cut strings, nodding along to his wife's words but looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt the way he used to when he was a boy and had done something wrong. Sarah pulled out papers from her folder, brochures for retirement communities with names like Golden Years Manor and Sunset Gardens, places with stock photos of smiling seniors playing cards and doing water aerobics. Nothing about the dignity of dying on land you'd worked your whole life, or being buried next to your wife in the family plot under the oak tree. But the real kicker came when Sarah pulled out another set of papers, legal documents with lots of fine print and official seals, explaining how they'd consulted with a lawyer about power of attorney and how it would be best for everyone if Tommy took over management of the farm's finances and operations. She said it with such practiced concern, like she was doing me a favor, like she was saving me from the burden of my own life's work, all while her eyes gleamed with barely concealed anticipation of finally getting her manicured hands on the deed to 400 acres of prime agricultural real estate. I listened to their whole presentation without interrupting, something Margaret always said was my superpower, the ability to keep my mouth shut and my ears open when most folks would be arguing. When Sarah finally finished, looking pleased with herself like a cat that had cornered a mouse, I stood up slowly, my knees creaking more than the rocking chair, and walked to the porch railing, looking out over fields that had been in my family since before Iowa was even a state. The silence stretched out like taffy. Tommy shifting uncomfortably on the swing, Sarah's smile starting to falter, as she realized I wasn't immediately agreeing to her carefully laid plans. Finally, I turned back to them and said the words that would set everything in motion, though they didn't know it at the time. I told them I needed time to think about it, that a man doesn't just give up his life's work without careful consideration, and that I'd give them an answer in a week. Sarah's face went through several expressions, frustration, annoyance, and finally settling on a forced understanding, probably figuring that a week's delay was worth it, if it meant avoiding a fight. They left shortly after, Tommy hugging me goodbye with what felt like an apology in his embrace, Sarah barely managing a stiff handshake before clicking back to their car in her inappropriate heels that sank into the gravel. As I watched their SUV disappear down the drive, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the afternoon sun, I knew that this was just the beginning. You see, what Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't know because she'd never bothered to really learn about the man she was trying to swindle, was that Harold Mitchell hadn't survived 78 years by being anybody's fool. The land had taught me patience, the weather had taught me to read signs, and losing Margaret had taught me that the most important things in life aren't always the most obvious ones. That night, I sat in my office, a converted bedroom that still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco I'd given up 20 years ago at Margaret's insistence, and pulled out a metal box from the bottom drawer of the desk my father had built. Inside were documents that told a different story than the one Sarah thought she knew. Papers that would make her grand plans crumble like drought-stricken soil. There were land surveys from 1892, mineral rights assessments from the 1950s, and, most importantly, a document that even Tommy didn't know existed, something I'd been saving for the right moment, though I'd hoped that moment would never come. The next morning, I drove into town, my old Ford pickup truck rattling and wheezing but still reliable after 20 years, and paid a visit to Jim Patterson, my lawyer for the past 40 years and one of the few people who knew all my secrets. Jim's office was above the hardware store on Main Street, up a narrow staircase that seemed to get steeper every year, filled with the smell of old books and strong coffee. Jim listened to my situation without interrupting, occasionally nodding his bald head that caught the light from the window overlooking the town square, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair with a smile that reminded me why I'd trusted him with my legal matters for 4 decades. We spent 3 hours that day going over documents, making phone calls, and setting things in motion that would soon teach Sarah a lesson about underestimating old farmers. Jim had gone to school with Tommy, remembered when the boy had won the 4-H championship with a calf I'd helped him raise, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes that Tommy had let himself be manipulated this way. But Jim was also a professional, and by the time I left his office, we had a plan that would not only protect the farm, but also, maybe, just maybe, save my son from making the biggest mistake of his life. The week passed slowly, each day bringing new evidence of Sarah's confidence that her plan was working. She called twice, supposedly to check on my well-being, but really to make sure I hadn't forgotten about their proposal. Her voice syrupy sweet in a way that made my teeth ache. Tommy texted once, a simple, "Love you, Dad," that broke my heart a little because I knew he was torn between his wife and his heritage, caught in a trap that Sarah had been setting since the day she'd learned about the farm's value. During that week, I also had visits from neighbors who'd mysteriously heard about developers sniffing around the area, offering prices that would make any farmer's head spin. Bob Jacobson mentioned it while helping me fix a gate. Mary Stewart brought it up when she dropped off a casserole, and even young Pete Williams from the co-op asked if the rumors were true that the Mitchell farm might be up for sale. I told them all the same thing, that nothing was decided yet, but I could see the concern in their eyes because they knew what development would mean for our little farming community. What really sealed Sarah's fate, though, was what happened on Thursday evening, just 3 days before I was supposed to give them my answer. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up the drive. It was a black Mercedes, as out of place on a farm as a tuxedo at a barn raising, and out stepped a man in a suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a decade. He introduced himself as Richard Brennan from Midwest Development Corporation, said he understood the property might soon be available, and quoted a number that would have made most farmers faint. But here's the thing about unexpected visitors with big offers: they usually tell you more than they mean to. Mr. Brennan let slip that he'd been contacted by someone close to the family who assured him the deal was practically done, that the old farmer was ready to retire and just needed a little push. He even mentioned that his contact had provided detailed information about the property, including some recent soil surveys that I certainly hadn't authorized. When I asked who this helpful contact was, Brennan realized he'd said too much and made a hasty exit. But the damage was done. That night, I called Jim Patterson at home, something I'd only done twice in 40 years, and told him about Brennan's visit. Jim's voice got that quiet tone that meant he was angry, really angry, and he promised to do some digging. By the next morning, he'd confirmed what I suspected. Sarah had been in contact with multiple developers for months, had somehow gotten copies of property assessments, and had even gone so far as to have preliminary development plans drawn up for turning the Mitchell farm into a subdivision called Heritage Estates, the irony of which wasn't lost on either of us. Saturday came with one of those perfect fall mornings that made you grateful to be alive and living in Iowa. The kind of day Margaret used to say God made to remind farmers why they chose this life. I spent the morning doing chores, taking my time with each task, running my hands over tools my grandfather had used, feeding animals whose bloodlines went back almost as far as mine on this land. After lunch, I put on my good shirt, the blue one Margaret always said brought out my eyes, and sat on the porch to wait for Tommy and Sarah. They arrived at exactly 2:00, Sarah probably insisting on punctuality, as if this was a business meeting instead of a family discussion. She was dressed like she was going to a country club, all pressed khakis and a sweater that probably cost more than a good milk cow, while Tommy wore jeans and the FFA jacket from high school that I was surprised still fit him. They sat on the swing again, Sarah with her leather folder clutched like a shield, Tommy looking everywhere but at me, studying the porch boards like they held the secrets of the universe. Sarah launched right into her pitch again, refined from the week before, talking about how they'd found the perfect assisted living facility only an hour away, how I could visit the farm whenever I wanted, how this was really the best solution for everyone involved. She pulled out new documents, ones that Jim had warned me about, that would give Tommy full power of attorney and control over all farm operations and financial decisions. She'd even thoughtfully highlighted where I needed to sign, little yellow tabs sticking out like accusations. When she finished, sliding the papers across the small table between us with the confidence of someone who'd already won, I picked them up and made a show of reading them carefully, even pulling out my reading glasses for effect. Tommy finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that gave me hope, a flicker of the boy who used to follow me around the farm asking a million questions, who cried when we had to put down his favorite horse, who understood that some things matter more than money. I set the papers down gently, took off my glasses and cleaned them with the handkerchief Margaret had embroidered with my initials 40 years ago, and then looked straight at Sarah with the same expression I used to use on cattle buyers who thought they could lowball me. I told her I appreciated her concern for my welfare, but I had a few questions first. She shifted uncomfortably, but nodded, probably figuring she could handle whatever this senile old farmer might ask. My first question was simple. I asked her if she knew what crop rotation meant and why it mattered. She stammered something about different plants and soil health, the kind of answer you'd get from a quick Google search. Then I asked her to name 3 types of native grasses that grew in our pastures, and she couldn't name even one. I asked her what year the barn was built, who built it, and why the weather vane on top was a horse instead of a rooster. Her face was getting redder with each question, but I wasn't done. I asked her if she knew where Margaret was buried, if she knew what her favorite flower was, if she knew that Tommy was born in this house during the worst blizzard in 20 years. I asked her if she knew that the oak tree by the pond was planted the day my father came home from World War II, or that the creek was named after my great-grandmother who died defending this land from claim jumpers. With each question, Sarah's confident facade cracked a little more, while Tommy sank deeper into himself, probably remembering the stories behind each of these facts. Finally, I asked her the most important question. I asked her if she knew about the mineral rights assessment from 1953 that showed significant oil deposits under the South 40 acres, deposits that we'd never tapped because my father believed the land was for growing food, not drilling holes. I asked if she knew about the conservation easement I'd placed on the property 5 years ago that prevented any development for the next 99 years. I asked if she knew about the trust I'd established that would ensure the farm stayed in agricultural use, regardless of who inherited it. Sarah's face went from red to white as she realized her grand plan was falling apart like a scarecrow in a tornado. But the real kicker came when I pulled out my own folder, not leather, but the old canvas one I'd carried to Farm Bureau meetings for 30 years, and laid out the evidence Jim Patterson had helped me gather. There were emails between Sarah and developers, dated months before today's conversation, discussing the upcoming availability of the Mitchell farm. There were copies of forged authorization forms she'd used to get those soil surveys done. There were even recordings, because Jim was thorough like that, of Sarah telling someone on the phone that the old fool will sign whatever we put in front of him. Tommy's head snapped up at that last bit, and for the first time in years I saw real anger in my son's eyes. Not at me, but at the woman sitting next to him. He asked to see the papers, and as he read through them, his face went through a transformation that reminded me of watching storm clouds build over the prairie. When he got to the email where Sarah called him weak but manageable, and said she could handle him once the old man is out of the picture. Something inside my son finally broke free from whatever spell she'd had him under. The silence that followed was heavy as a full grain bin, the kind of silence that comes before everything changes. Sarah tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to say the emails were taken out of context, but Tommy held up his hand and she stopped mid-sentence. He stood up slowly, walked to the porch railing, and looked out over the farm with eyes that were finally seeing clearly. When he turned back, he looked at Sarah like he was seeing her for the first time, and what he saw made him step away from her like she was a snake in the corn crib. What happened next was something I'll remember until the day they plant me next to Margaret under that oak tree. Tommy walked over to me, got down on his knees right there on the porch his great-grandfather built, and with tears streaming down his face, asked for my forgiveness. He said he'd been a fool, that he'd let city life and Sarah's ambitions cloud his judgment, that he'd forgotten who he was and where he came from. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but he wanted me to know that he'd never really wanted to take the farm. He'd just wanted to make his wife happy and had lost himself in the process. Sarah stood there, her perfect composure finally shattered, alternating between threats and pleas, saying she'd take us both to court, that she'd prove I was incompetent, that Tommy would never leave her because she'd take everything in the divorce. But you see, that's when I played my final card, the one I'd been holding back, hoping I'd never have to use it. I told Sarah about the prenuptial agreement Tommy had signed before their marriage, the one she thought protected her assets, but that Jim Patterson had recently discovered actually protected Tommy's inheritance from any claim she might make in a divorce. The prenup had been Sarah's idea, of course, so confident was she in her ability to manipulate my son that she never imagined he might one day wake up and leave her. She'd had her lawyer draw it up, but Tommy, in a moment of clarity or maybe just dumb luck, had taken it to Jim Patterson for review. Jim, being the thorough country lawyer he was, had made a few subtle changes that Sarah's city lawyer hadn't caught. Changes that meant the farm and any inheritance from it would remain solely Tommy's in the event of a divorce. Sarah's face went through more colors than a sunset as she realized she'd been outmaneuvered by the very people she'd considered beneath her. She grabbed her leather folder and her purse, told Tommy he'd regret this, and stormed off to their SUV. But here's the thing about city folks' cars on country driveways. They don't handle righteous anger very well. She gunned it in reverse, hit the drainage ditch at the end of the drive, and got stuck good and proper in the mud from last week's rain. Tommy and I stood on the porch, watching her try to rock the vehicle free, mud spraying everywhere, her designer outfit getting splattered every time she got out to check the tires. Finally, Tommy sighed and said he supposed he should help her. But I put my hand on his shoulder and suggested we let her call her own tow truck. Sometimes, I told him, people need to sit in the mess they've made for a while to really understand what they've done. We went inside, leaving Sarah to her predicament, and I made us coffee, strong and black the way Mitchell men had been drinking it for generations. We sat at the kitchen table where Tommy had done his homework as a boy, where his mother had taught him to read, where 4 generations of Mitchells had shared meals and stories and dreams. Tommy told me about the last few years, how Sarah had slowly isolated him from his farming friends, how she'd convinced him that his heritage was something to be ashamed of, how she'd made him feel like he was never good enough unless he was making more money, buying bigger things, impressing people who didn't really matter. He told me about the nights he'd lie awake missing the farm, missing the smell of fresh-cut hay and the sound of cattle lowing at dawn, missing the satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands instead of calling someone to do it for you. He told me how Sarah would mock him when he'd suggest visiting more often, saying the farm was just a tax burden waiting to happen, that I was too stubborn to see what was best for everyone, that family was just an accident of birth, and what really mattered was what you could build for yourself. As we talked, the sun started setting. Painting the kitchen gold through the windows Margaret had insisted on installing to catch the evening light. Outside, we could hear Sarah on her phone, voice shrill as she demanded someone come immediately to pull her out, threatening lawsuits when the local tow company said it would be at least 2 hours because they were busy with real emergencies. Tommy smiled sadly at that, remembering how country folk prioritize things differently than city folk, how a farmer with a broken-down combine during harvest will always come before an angry woman in an expensive car. I told Tommy about the farm's real situation, things I'd kept from him not out of mistrust, but because I wanted him to choose this life freely, not feel obligated by money. I told him about the oil deposits we'd never touched, about the offers from wind companies to put turbines on the ridgeline, about the conservation programs that paid us to keep certain fields wild for wildlife habitat. I showed him the books, the real books, not the simplified versions I'd let Sarah see, and his eyes widened when he realized the farm was worth far more than even Sarah had imagined, but that its real value wasn't in dollars but in legacy. We talked until well past dark, the kitchen light creating a warm bubble, while outside we could hear Sarah finally being pulled free by Big Mike's towing. Mike himself probably enjoying every minute of extracting that fancy SUV from our good Iowa mud. Tommy asked if he could stay the night, sleep in his old room, and I said of course, though we'd have to make the bed since I'd turned it into storage for Margaret's quilting supplies. He helped me move the boxes, handling his mother's things with a reverence that told me he remembered her teaching him to sew buttons and hem pants, skills Sarah had mocked as beneath a modern man. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the old house, I heard Tommy on the phone with a lawyer Jim had recommended, starting divorce proceedings that would be brutal but necessary. I heard him call his boss, explaining he'd need some time off to handle family matters, and then I heard him do something that made my old heart swell with pride. He called the Jacobson boys and asked if they needed any help with harvest, said he was staying at the farm for a while and wanted to make himself useful. The next morning, Tommy was up before dawn, had coffee ready when I came downstairs, and was wearing his old work clothes that I'd kept in the mudroom closet, though they were a bit tighter than they used to be. We did chores together like we had when he was a boy, him remembering without being told how to approach the horses, how to spread feed for the chickens, how to check the water troughs for ice even though it was still early fall. The familiar rhythm came back to him like riding a bike, and I saw a peace in his eyes that had been missing for years. Sarah, as it turned out, didn't go quietly into that good night. Over the next several weeks, she tried everything from hiring investigators to prove I was senile to attempting to freeze Tommy's assets to spreading rumors in town that we were abusing her. But here's the thing about small farming communities. We protect our own. Every investigator she sent got politely stonewalled by locals who suddenly couldn't remember anything useful. Her lawyer received a visit from Judge Harrison, whose family had been farming next to ours for 3 generations, suggesting that big city legal tactics might not play well in his courtroom. The divorce was finalized just before Christmas. Sarah getting what she'd brought into the marriage and not a penny more. The prenup she'd insisted on becoming the instrument of her own downfall. She moved back to Chicago, Last I heard was working at some marketing firm, probably spinning stories about her tragic marriage to a farmer who chose dirt over diamonds. Tommy stayed on the farm, taking over more of the daily operations, but not because I couldn't handle them, rather because he wanted to, needed to, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years, finally remembering how to breathe. We worked together through that winter, fixing equipment in the barn while snow piled up outside, planning for spring planting, teaching him the things I'd tried to teach him before, but he hadn't been ready to learn. He started dating Amy Patterson, Jim's daughter, who'd just moved back from Minneapolis after her own journey of discovering that home isn't where you are, but who you're with and what you're building together. She understood farming, had grown up showing cattle at the county fair, and, most importantly, she looked at the land with respect, not greed. The following spring, as we planted corn in fields that had been planted by Mitchells for over a century, Tommy asked me about the documents I'd shown Sarah, about the plans I'd made to protect the farm. I told him the truth, that I'd seen this coming years ago, had watched how she looked at the land like a spreadsheet instead of a living thing, and had taken steps to ensure that no matter what happened, this farm would continue to grow food, provide habitat, and stand as a testament to what happens when you work with the land instead of against it. I showed him the full conservation easement, the trust documents, the mineral rights agreements that ensured any extraction would have to be done with minimal environmental impact and with profits going back into land preservation. I showed him the letters from the State Historical Society about preserving the barn and the original homestead cabin hidden in the back 40. I showed him the scholarship fund I'd set up at the Agricultural College, funded by some of those wind turbine payments, ensuring that kids from farming families could get educated without losing their connection to the land. But, most importantly, I showed him the journal I'd been keeping for 40 years, the one Margaret had given me when Tommy was born, where I'd written down not just farming records, but stories, memories, lessons learned, and wisdom gained. Each entry was dated, some just a few lines about the weather or a successful harvest, others pages long about dealing with loss, about watching the community change, about the fear that my son might lose his way, and the hope that he'd find it again. I gave him the journal and told him to continue it, to write his own stories and lessons, to pass it on to his children when the time came. As I write this, it's been 2 years since that day Sarah tried to steal our heritage and ended up losing everything she'd schemed for. Tommy and Amy got married last summer in a simple ceremony in the backyard, under the apple trees Margaret and I had planted for our 25th anniversary. The farm is thriving. We've added some heritage breed cattle to our operation, started a small organic vegetable plot that Amy sells at the farmer's market, and even restored the old windmill that my great-grandfather had built. Sarah's name is rarely mentioned now, like a bad storm that passed through leaving damage, but also clearing the air for new growth. Sometimes I wonder if she ever understood what she lost. Not just the money she'd counted on, but the chance to be part of something bigger than herself, something rooted in history and reaching toward the future. But mostly, I don't think about her at all, too busy teaching my new grandson, little Harold Thomas Mitchell, born last month, about the land that will one day be his to tend and protect. The farm endures, as it always has, through droughts and floods, through good times and bad, through the schemes of those who would exploit it, and the dedication of those who understand its true value. Every morning, I still wake at 4:30, make my coffee, and stand on the porch watching the sun rise over fields that have fed families for over a century. Now, though, I'm often joined by Tommy and sometimes Amy with the baby. 4 generations of Mitchells watching the dawn of another day on land that no amount of money could ever truly buy. The revelation of Sarah's betrayal was like pulling a weed only to discover an entire root system of deception spreading beneath the surface. And as winter gave way to spring on the Mitchell farm, we began to understand just how deep her schemes had run. It started with small discoveries, like the credit cards Tommy found that Sarah had opened in his name, maxed out with purchases for things he'd never seen. Designer clothes and jewelry that she'd probably stashed somewhere, planning for a future where she was a wealthy widow or divorcee. Then came bigger revelations, like the life insurance policies she'd tried to take out on me, denied by companies that had the good sense to require my signature, though she'd certainly tried to forge it based on the practice signatures Tommy found in her abandoned desk drawer. But what really showed us the extent of Sarah's cold calculation was the diary Amy discovered while helping Tommy clean out the house in Des Moines, preparing it for sale. Hidden behind other books on a shelf, it was less a diary and more a business plan, dating back to before she'd even married Tommy, detailing her strategy for acquiring the farm, complete with timelines, contingency plans, and even a section on managing the old man that would have been amusing if it wasn't so chillin'. She'd researched everything from Iowa inheritance law to the symptoms of dementia, had notes on which local officials might be susceptible to bribes, and even had a list of developers ranked by their offers, some dating back 3 years. Tommy took it hard, realizing that his entire marriage had been a business transaction for Sarah, that every moment of affection had been calculated for maximum return on investment. But Amy, bless her practical soul, pointed out that Sarah's failure was the best thing that could have happened to him, like a vaccination against future deception. She helped him see that Sarah's elaborate planning had ultimately been her downfall, so focused on the prize that she'd forgotten to actually understand what she was trying to steal, like a thief who breaks into a library and tries to sell the books by the pound. Spring planting that year was different, charged with a renewed sense of purpose as Tommy threw himself into the work with the dedication of a man rediscovering his calling. We expanded the operation, not in the way Sarah had envisioned with development and exploitation, but thoughtfully adding value through diversification and sustainable practices. Amy's vegetable garden grew from a small plot to 2 full acres of organic produce, and we converted the old dairy barn into a farm store where locals and tourists alike could buy fresh eggs, seasonal vegetables, and Amy's homemade preserves that used Margaret's recipes. The Jacobson boys, who'd been renting our far fields, approached us about a partnership rather than just rental, and we worked out an arrangement that benefited everyone, combining resources for better equipment while maintaining the independence that farmers cherish. Young Pete Williams from the co-op started stopping by regularly, not just for business, but to learn from Tommy and me about soil management and crop rotation, eager to understand farming as a craft rather than just a business. It reminded me that knowledge passed down is never lost, only transformed by each generation that receives it. One afternoon in late May, while Tommy and I were repairing the old corn planter that my father had bought secondhand in 1962 and still worked better than most new machines, Sheriff Dan Morrison pulled up the drive in his official vehicle, though his relaxed demeanor suggested this wasn't an emergency. Dan had gone to school with Tommy, had been at their wedding, and his expression was somewhere between amused and sympathetic as he explained that Sarah had filed a complaint claiming we'd stolen valuable items from the Des Moines house during the divorce proceedings. The Valuable items turned out to be farm equipment catalogs, Tommy's FFA trophies, and a quilt Margaret had made for their wedding that Sarah had stuffed in the attic and forgotten about until she needed something to cause trouble with. Dan had to follow up on the complaint officially, but he made it clear he thought it was nonsense, especially when Tommy showed him receipts and photos proving everything taken had been his before the marriage, or explicitly given to him in the divorce settlement. Dan stayed for coffee and Amy's apple pie, reminiscing about the time in high school when Tommy had won the state fair's pie-eating contest and then threw up on Sarah's shoes at their first meeting, which should have been an omen if anyone had been paying attention. As summer reached its peak, with corn standing tall enough to hide a man on horseback and soybeans spreading green as far as the eye could see, we received an unexpected visitor who would reveal another layer of Sarah's deception. Her name was Jennifer Chen, a private investigator from Chicago who'd been hired by Sarah's father, a man we'd met only once at the wedding and who'd seemed as cold and calculating as his daughter. But Jennifer wasn't here on Sarah's behalf. Instead, she'd come to warn us and to apologize for her unwitting part in Sarah's schemes. It turned out that Sarah had hired Jennifer months before the divorce to investigate me, looking for signs of incompetence, hidden assets, or anything that could be used to challenge my mental capacity or claim elder abuse. Jennifer had done her job thoroughly, too thoroughly for Sarah's liking, because what she'd found was a sharp, competent farmer with his affairs in perfect order, beloved by his community, and with no signs whatsoever of the dementia Sarah had been hoping to manufacture. When Jennifer had reported these findings, Sarah had fired her and refused to pay the full fee, claiming the investigation had been incomplete. Jennifer, being a professional who didn't appreciate being stiffed, had done some investigating of her own and discovered Sarah's pattern of deception extending far beyond our farm. There had been a previous marriage to an older man in California, ended when his children discovered Sarah's attempts to change his will, and before that, a series of relationships with older men that ended when they or their families became suspicious. Jennifer gave us copies of her research, not out of spite but out of respect for what she called good people who deserved better, and warned us that Sarah might not be done trying to cause trouble. She was right about that. 2 weeks later, we started getting calls from reporters about a story Sarah was shopping around, painting herself as a victim of rural sexism and elder manipulation, claiming I'd turned her husband against her because I couldn't stand a strong, independent woman having opinions about the farm. The narrative was compelling enough that a few outlets showed initial interest until they actually visited the farm and met the people involved. It's hard to maintain a story about backward rural folks when you're standing in a thriving organic operation run by 3 generations working in harmony, with a female partner who's respected throughout the county for her business acumen. Mary Stewart from the newspaper wrote a beautiful piece about our farm, but not about the drama Sarah was trying to create. Instead, she focused on the conservation efforts, the partnership with the agricultural college, and the way we were proving that family farms could thrive in the modern economy without selling out to developers. The article featured a photo of Tommy teaching little Harold to pet the chickens, with me and Amy in the background working on the vegetable garden, 4 generations united in purpose. Sarah's victim narrative died before it could take root, choked out by the simple truth of people living their lives with integrity. August brought the county fair, and for the first time in 15 years the Mitchell farm had entries in multiple categories. Amy's Preserves won 3 blue ribbons, our heritage breed chickens took best in show, and Tommy's restored 1948 John Deere tractor won the vintage machinery competition. But the moment that meant the most was when little Harold, barely able to walk, toddled onto the stage with Amy to receive the award for Best Heirloom Tomatoes. 4 generations of Mitchell farming represented in that simple moment of a baby holding a ribbon he didn't understand but would someday treasure. Sarah made one last attempt to insert herself into our lives that fall, showing up unannounced during harvest time, dressed inappropriately as always in white pants and heels that sank into the freshly turned earth. She claimed she'd left some jewelry in the barn, pieces of sentimental value that had belonged to her grandmother, and she demanded to search for them. Tommy was ready to argue, but I put a hand on his shoulder and told Sarah she was welcome to look. Knowing full well she'd never set foot in our barn during her entire marriage, and certainly hadn't hidden any jewelry there. What she was really looking for became clear when I caught her trying to photograph financial documents in my office while pretending to use the bathroom. The documents were decoys, of course, papers Jim Patterson had prepared specifically for this possibility, showing the farm deep in debt with multiple liens that would make it worthless to developers. Sarah's face when she thought she'd discovered we were broke was almost worth the disruption to our harvest schedule, and her hasty departure, muttering about wasted time and worthless land, was the last we saw of her. The truth about the farm's finances, which we kept between family and Jim Patterson, was that we were doing better than ever. The organic certification Amy had pushed for allowed us to charge premium prices, the conservation payments were substantial, and the wind turbines on the ridge, barely visible from the house but positioned perfectly for maximum generation, provided steady income that we reinvested in equipment and infrastructure. We weren't rich by city standards, but we were wealthy in all the ways that mattered. Good land, strong community ties, and a clear purpose passed down through generations. That Christmas was the first in years that felt complete, with Tommy and Amy hosting dinner in the main house while I played grandfather to little Harold, teaching him to stack blocks while outside snow fell on fields lying fallow, resting and regenerating for spring. The Jacobson family joined us, as did Jim Patterson and his wife, Mary Stewart and her husband, and even Sheriff Dan Morrison, whose wife had passed the year before and who needed family more than solitude. We told stories of harvests past, sang carols Margaret had loved, and made plans for the coming year that included expanding the farm store and maybe adding a few sheep to the operation. Tommy gave me a gift that Christmas that meant more than any expensive present Sarah had ever grudgingly selected. It was a new journal, leather-bound like the one I'd given him, but with a photo of 4 generations of Mitchells embedded in the cover, taken at the county fair with all of us covered in dust and smiling like we'd won the lottery, which in a way we had. Inside the front cover, he'd written, "For Dad, who taught me that the best revenge against those who would steal our heritage is to live it fully, pass it on freely, and tend it faithfully." Winter settled over the farm like a familiar blanket, with short days spent maintaining equipment and long evenings spent planning for spring. Tommy and I rebuilt the old chicken coop that had been Margaret's domain, preparing it for a larger flock come spring, while Amy researched heritage breeds and direct-to-consumer marketing strategies. Little Harold learned to walk that winter, his first solo journey across the kitchen floor to the window, where he could see the horses in the pasture, drawn to the animals like every Mitchell child before him. In February, we received word through Jim Patterson that Sarah had remarried, this time to a real estate developer in Florida who was 20 years her senior and apparently unaware of her history. Jim had this information because the developer's lawyer had called to verify the divorce settlement, probably at Sarah's prompting to ensure there were no lingering claims to the farm. We wished the man luck, though privately we wondered how long it would be before Sarah's true nature revealed itself again, like a weed that keeps coming back no matter how many times you pull it. The 1-year anniversary of Sarah's failed coup passed without fanfare, marked only by Tommy and me sharing a knowing look over morning coffee before heading out to check on the cattle. The farm had absorbed her attempted betrayal like it absorbed everything else: heavy rains, harsh droughts, economic downturns, and personal tragedies, processing them all into the rich soil of experience that made the next season possible. We didn't celebrate her failure so much as our survival, the way you don't celebrate getting over the flu, but simply appreciate breathing freely again. Spring arrived early that year, with crocuses pushing through the last snow in March and the old apple trees budding before April. We planted 40 acres of sweet corn for the local market, expanded Amy's vegetable operation to include a greenhouse for year-round production, and added 10 heritage breed piglets that would be raised on pasture and sold as premium pork to restaurants in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. The farm was evolving, not abandoning its traditions but adapting them to new markets and opportunities, proving that innovation and heritage could coexist. The real vindication of our approach came when the Agricultural College approached us about becoming a demonstration farm for sustainable practices, offering to pay for infrastructure improvements in exchange for hosting student visits and workshops. Tommy took the lead on this project, his education finally serving its intended purpose of bridging the gap between traditional knowledge and modern science. Watching him teach college students about soil health while standing in the same field where I'd taught him to plant corn by hand was a full-circle moment that Margaret would have loved. One morning in late April, while Amy and I were transplanting tomato seedlings in the greenhouse, she told me she was pregnant again, another Mitchell to carry on the tradition. Tommy's joy when she told him that evening reminded me of my own reaction when Margaret had told me about him. That mixture of excitement and terror that comes with realizing you're responsible for passing on not just genes, but values, knowledge, and a way of life. We celebrated quietly, just family, understanding that the best celebrations are often the smallest ones. As summer approached, the farm hummed with activity and purpose. The Jacobson boys had expanded our partnership to include their cousin from Minnesota, a young woman named Beth who'd studied agricultural marketing and saw opportunity where others saw only tradition. The farm store, now managed primarily by Amy with Beth's help, had become a destination for people seeking not just fresh produce, but a connection to where their food came from. We hosted school groups, teaching children who'd never seen a cow up close that milk didn't originate in plastic jugs and eggs didn't spontaneously appear in cartons. The irony wasn't lost on us that Sarah's attempt to monetize the farm had actually pushed us to discover new revenue streams we'd never considered, though our approach honored the land rather than exploited it. Her vision of heritage estates, that proposed subdivision that would have destroyed everything, had been replaced by a heritage that was actually worth preserving, one that provided food, education, and community connection, rather than just expensive houses with no soul. In July, during the peak of sweet corn season, when we were selling hundreds of dozens at the farm store and local markets, a familiar black Mercedes pulled up the drive, the same car Richard Brennan from Midwest Development Corporation had driven 2 years earlier. But this time, he wasn't alone, and he wasn't here to make an offer. He'd brought his teenage daughter, Sophie, who was doing a summer project on sustainable agriculture, and had convinced her father that our farm was exactly what she needed to study. The conversation that followed was surreal, with Brennan apologizing for his previous approach and admitting that Sarah had badly misrepresented the situation. He'd since learned about her pattern of deception and felt genuinely bad about his role, however small, in her scheme. More importantly, his daughter's interest in sustainable farming had opened his eyes to the value of preserving agricultural land rather than developing it. He even offered to connect us with conservation organizations that could provide additional funding for our educational programs, a complete reversal from his original intentions. Sophie spent 3 days on the farm, following Tommy and me through our routines, asking intelligent questions and working harder than I'd expected from a city kid. She helped with morning chores, learned to drive the old tractor, and even assisted Amy with canning tomatoes, ending up covered in juice but grinning like she'd discovered gold. When she left, she hugged me and said she finally understood why some things shouldn't be for sale, a wisdom that had taken her father 50 years to learn but that she'd grasped in 3 days of honest work. August brought another county fair, and this time our presence was even stronger. Tommy's restored tractors had become something of a local attraction. Amy's preserves were sought after by buyers from 3 counties, and little Harold, now steady on his feet, showed a chicken in the children's division with the serious concentration of someone 3 times his age. But the highlight was the announcement that our farm had been selected for the state's Century Farm recognition, honoring operations that had been in the same family for over 100 years while adapting to modern challenges. The ceremony was held right on our farm in September, with the governor himself presenting the plaque that would hang in our kitchen next to Margaret's collection of blue ribbons from decades of county fairs. The crowd included neighbors, customers, students we'd taught, and even some of the reporters who'd initially been interested in Sarah's victim story but had instead become supporters of our mission. Tommy gave a speech about the importance of family farms, Amy talked about connecting consumers with their food sources, and I just stood there holding Harold, watching the sun set over fields that had survived every attempt to diminish them. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the farm had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, Tommy and I sat on the porch where everything had started, where Sarah had revealed her true nature and inadvertently set us on a path that made us stronger. We didn't talk much, just watched the fireflies dance over the soybean fields and listened to the night sounds that city folks call silence, but farmers know as the earth's evening conversation. Finally, Tommy asked if I thought Sarah ever regretted what she'd lost, not the money, but the chance to be part of something real. I told him that people like Sarah don't regret losing what they never understood they had. She saw the farm as a commodity to be liquidated, not a living system that had sustained generations. She saw our family as an obstacle to her goals, not a source of strength that could have enriched her life immeasurably. She saw tradition as backward thinking, not accumulated wisdom that could have taught her patience, resilience, and the deep satisfaction of working with rather than against the natural world. Her punishment wasn't losing the farm, but never understanding what she'd tried to steal. As fall progressed toward winter, the farm settled into its seasonal rhythm of harvest, preparation, and rest. We brought in one of our best corn yields ever, the soybeans exceeded expectations, and Amy's expanded vegetable operation had turned a profit in its first full year. The farm store had become a community gathering place, with locals stopping by not just to shop, but to catch up on news, share recipes, and maintain the social fabric that makes rural communities resilient. We'd even started hosting monthly dinners featuring food grown entirely on the farm, with Tommy cooking recipes Margaret had left behind and Amy adding her own creative touches. The announcement of Amy's pregnancy became public when she started showing, and the community's response reminded us why we'd fought so hard to preserve this way of life. Neighbors dropped by with baby clothes their children had outgrown. Customers at the farm store offered parenting advice and encouragement, and the elderly church ladies who'd known Margaret organized a surprise baby shower that filled our house with 3 generations of farm families celebrating new life. Sarah would never understand that this, not money, was true wealth. In November, just before Thanksgiving, we received an unexpected package from Jennifer Chen, the private investigator who'd warned us about Sarah's past. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a Florida paper, a small item about a divorce filing between Sarah and the developer she'd married. The marriage had lasted less than 2 years, ending when the developer's adult children had discovered discrepancies in their father's accounts and changes to his will that he didn't remember making. Jennifer's note was brief. "Thought you'd want to know. Some people never change. Glad your family's thriving." We didn't feel vindicated or pleased by Sarah's continued failures, just a sort of sad recognition that she was trapped in a pattern she'd probably repeat until she ran out of victims or finally faced real consequences. Tommy burned the clipping in the wood stove, saying he didn't want that energy in our house, and we never spoke of it again. Sarah had become like a disease we'd survived. Important to remember so we could recognize the symptoms, but not something to dwell on now that we'd recovered. Thanksgiving that year was a testament to everything Sarah had tried and failed to destroy. The table, built by my grandfather and expanded by my father to seat 12, groaned under the weight of food we'd grown ourselves. Turkey raised on pasture, vegetables from Amy's garden, bread made from wheat grown by the Jacobsons and ground at the old mill in town, and pies from apples picked in our orchard. 4 generations sat around that table, from me at 78 to Harold at 18 months, with Tommy and Amy in between, and the new baby due in spring to complete the circle. As we went around the table, sharing what we were thankful for, a tradition Margaret had started and we'd maintained, the answers painted a picture of a life rebuilt stronger after near disaster. Tommy was thankful for second chances and the wisdom to recognize them. Amy was thankful for a family that had welcomed her not as an outsider, but as someone coming home. Little Harold, coached by his parents, managed to say tractor, which was close enough to thankful to count. And I was thankful for the land's patience with human folly, for its ability to endure our mistakes and still provide abundance when tended with respect. Winter came early and hard that year, with a blizzard in December that reminded old-timers of the storms of their youth. We lost power for 3 days, but the wood stove kept us warm, the root cellar kept us fed, and the generator Jim Patterson had convinced me to buy years ago kept the essential systems running. Tommy and I spent those snowed-in days teaching Harold to play with wooden blocks my grandfather had carved, while Amy worked on a business plan for expanding our educational programs come spring. The forced isolation felt less like confinement and more like the earth insisting we slow down and pay attention to what mattered. As the year drew to a close, I found myself thinking about the journey we'd taken from that day Sarah had tried to steal our heritage to now, when the farm was thriving beyond what even I had imagined possible. Her betrayal, painful as it had been, had forced us to articulate why this life mattered, to defend it not just with emotion but with action, innovation, and adaptation. In trying to destroy us, she'd actually catalyzed our evolution from a traditional farm holding on to the past to a modern operation that honored the past while embracing the future. The week between Christmas and New Year brought unexpected visitors, a young couple from Chicago who'd bought the house Tommy and Sarah had shared in Des Moines. They'd found a box in the attic with some of Tommy's things, photos from high school, his FFA jacket that he thought had been lost, and, surprisingly, a letter he'd written to himself in college about his dreams for the future. In that letter, 20-year-old Tommy had written about wanting to find a way to honor his heritage while making his own mark, to prove that farming could be both traditional and innovative, to raise children who understood where food came from and why it mattered. Reading that letter, Tommy got quiet in the way men do when emotion threatens to overwhelm them. Amy took his hand, I put Harold on his lap, and we sat in the kitchen while snow fell outside, understanding that sometimes the greatest revenge against those who would derail our dreams is to achieve them despite the obstacles. Young Tommy had known what he wanted before Sarah convinced him he wanted something else, and finding his way back to that truth had made him not just a better farmer, but a better man. New Year's Eve found us not at some party or celebration, but doing what farmers do, checking on animals, making sure water troughs weren't frozen, and preparing for whatever weather January might bring. As midnight approached, Amy insisted we toast with her homemade elderberry wine, made from bushes Margaret had planted along the creek 20 years ago. We stood on the porch, despite the cold, looking out over fields covered in snow that would soon melt into the soil, enriching it for another season of growth. Tommy raised his glass and offered a toast that would have made his mother proud. To the land that sustains us, the family that supports us, and the wisdom to know that some things can't be bought, sold, or stolen, only earned through seasons of patient work. We clinked glasses, Harold mimicked us with his sippy cup, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted its approval of another year survived and transcended. As I write this final entry, it's been 3 years since Sarah tried to take everything and ended up with nothing. The farm has not just survived but thrived. Tommy has become the farmer I always knew he could be. Amy has brought new energy and ideas that complement our traditions, and Harold already shows signs of being the 5th generation to work this land. The new baby, another boy we've named James after my father, was born in the same bedroom where Tommy was born, with the same doctor's son attending, because some circles are meant to be completed. Sarah's legacy, if you can call it that, is that she taught us to value what we'd taken for granted, to protect what we'd assumed was secure, and to articulate why this way of life matters in a world increasingly disconnected from its food sources. Her greed and deception forced us to become better stewards, better teachers, and better family members. In trying to destroy us, she made us indestructible, not through walls or weapons, but through the bonds of shared purpose and mutual respect that no amount of scheming can break. The Mitchell farm will outlive us all, passing to Harold and James and their children in turn, each generation adding their own innovations while maintaining the core truth that land cared for will care for you in return. The conservation easements ensure it will never be developed. The educational programs guarantee its wisdom will be shared, and the family trust means it will remain whole and productive long after everyone who witnessed Sarah's betrayal has returned to the soil we've tended so faithfully. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rises from the fields and the world feels newly made, I think about what my grandfather would say about everything that's happened. He'd probably chuckle at the drama, shake his head at Sarah's foolishness, and then get back to work. Because that's what farmers do. We endure, we adapt, we persist, and ultimately we prevail. Not through grand gestures or clever schemes, but through the simple daily act of tending what's been entrusted to us. The sun is setting now over fields that will soon be planted with another season's hope, and Harold is calling for his grandpa to come see the chicken he's befriended. Life goes on, seasons turn, and the Mitchell farm stands as proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply living well, loving deeply, and passing on something worth inheriting to those wise enough to recognize its true value. Sarah wanted our land but never understood our life, and in the end, that misunderstanding cost her everything while giving us the push we needed to preserve everything that truly mattered.